As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be...
I ended up basically skimming any review of the Batman that didn't talk about The Long Halloween. I get that most reviewers are not going to know what The Long Halloween is, but I really did not see it mentioned much at all, and that's weird. I mean, the Batman just is an adaptation of The Long Halloween. It shuffles things up a bit, but not more than, say, Iron Man 3, an adaptation of Extremis, or Captain America Civil War. And listen, if you had 3 hours to watch The Batman, take 3 hours to watch the two-part animated The Long Halloween. It's pretty good. The Long Halloween is set early in Batman's career, and is kind of supposed to transition the character from the sort of Batman Year One characterization to the more developed and less grounded characterization of most Batman stories. It follows two interlocking stories. On the one side, Bruce Wayne finds himself enmeshed in gangland politics because his father, Thomas Wayne, was connected in some way to Mafia Don Carmine Falcone, sometimes pronounced Falcone, just roll with it, who is dealing with internal family troubles and long-standing conflict with the other major Mafia crime family, the Maronis. On the other, Batman is on the track of a serial killer targeting Mafia figures and corrupt members of the government, known as Holiday, because they only strike on holidays. Around midway through, the story complicates as it attempts to execute that transition from Batman vs. organized crime to Batman vs. costumed supervillains, and so it functions as a reintroduction of Joker, Calendar Man, Poison Ivy, Solomon Grundy, and among others, Two-Face. While Batman and the authorities believe they caught the Holiday killer, Alberto Falcone, it turns out that it was actually, or primarily, Two-Face's wife, Gilda Dent. Meanwhile, Bruce Wayne must come to terms with the fact that his father, earnest as he was in his desire to do good, made difficult choices in difficult situations, and with the reality that he'll never know who killed his parents, in a way that it was really the city that killed his parents. And that's not exactly the story of the Batman, but you can see the bones. The Holiday killer has been shifted to a more familiar character, the Riddler, for the benefit of the mass audience. The Falcone-Maroni gang war specifically has been moved into the background, though the key plot element of Falcone's corruption of the city government, as well as the relationship between Falcone and the Waynes, those are kept front and center. The reintroduction of the supervillains is dramatically minimized, probably because they just overcomplicate the story, replaced by a single appearance by the Joker, and, well, we'll get to that more. And if you don't talk about the Batman as an adaptation, you're going to get led down some nonsense paths. Like, I've seen discussion of Matt Reeves' decision not to have Gordon be the commissioner yet, what he's trying to communicate about the state of the Batman world, or what that means for his plans for future installments, when it's clearly just an adaptation of a story in which Gordon's not the commissioner yet. That's not to say by any stretch that there's not space for new meaning. For example, you can absolutely talk about what's achieved by adapting this story. You can absolutely talk about what's achieved by making these changes. So what is the Batman bringing to the table? A few things. One thing it's bringing in is the money. So God help me, we're going to have to talk about Batman's money, and let's just get it out of the way now. You basically can't talk about Batman without talking about why Batman doesn't spend all that money on charitable causes, and within a certain framework that is a reasonable criticism. The usual rejoinder, and this is established textually in the comics, is that Batman does give lots of money to charities, but that's not entirely satisfying. See, Batman used to be pretty rich, like old money rich, like owns a huge estate just outside the city. Rich like people treat him like he's important even though he seems to live a life of total idleness. Back in 1974, the total market cap of Wayne Enterprises, this is already some decades into Batman's career as businessman, was $27,400,000, adjusted for inflation over $150 million. But 50 years later, Batman is one of the, say, 3 or 4 wealthiest people on Earth. Batman is so rich that, canonically, textually, his butler is also a billionaire. Why? Well, on the one hand, being rich is a fantasy, and Batman is a fantasy, and $150 million is chump change as rich people fantasies go. On the other hand, Batman stories became more grounded, more contiguous, and more literal. And that literalism means that narrative elements have to hold together more literally. And Batman's got a jet fighter. Batman's got a jet fighter he successfully hid from all financial authorities. If the jet fighter is a real thing that exists in a real world, then Batman has to be a mega billionaire. The problem is, Batman with $20 million is ethically a different beast than Batman with $20 billion. Batman with $20 million has a responsibility to be philanthropic, and he is. But Batman with $20 billion has a responsibility to completely solve major social problems. Batman with $20 billion could solve hunger, or child poverty, or unsheltered sleeping in Gotham, and he hasn't. He's spending hundreds of millions of dollars dressing up like a bat punching criminals, and he hasn't just solved these social problems. Okay, is that all a reasonable criticism? Sort of. Here's the thing. You are obliged to take this as a characteristic of Batman's world, that it's heroic in the world that Batman lives in to do what Batman does. Batman Begins accomplishes this in about 20 seconds of film.
In a way, their murder shocked the wealthy and the powerful into action.
People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne.
Of course, all that really does is draw the criticism out of the character and make it criticism of the work. Criticism that reactionary and paternalistic narratives of crime and of wealth are baked into the Batman story and can't really be gotten out. All of which is to say, the Batman is bizarrely fixated on this problem.
The prizes are coming for breakfast.
Here? Why?
Because I couldn't get you to go there.
I haven't got time for this.
It's getting serious, Bruce. If this continues, it won't be long before you've nothing left.
I don't care about that.
It does have a certain amount of grace about it, although I was kind of amused by how jarring it is when the movie admitted that an estate the size of Bruce Wayne's does require more than one staff member.
Mr. Pennyworth,
Yes, Dory.
the accountants are here.
See them in, please, Dory.
But there's no getting around the fact that the entire plot revolves around an effort by the Wayne family to make a massive charitable contribution to accomplish reform, a contribution that the movie tells us only fed Gotham's corruption. Basically, everyone in the movie's motivations or actions are contextualized in terms of reform, or their relationship to reform's architect, Thomas Wayne. Reform defines the web of corruption all the politicians and cops are in. Reform put Falcone where he is. Reform is the source of the Riddler's pain. And ultimately, reform created Batman. So fine. Here it is, at length, an argument. Why doesn't Batman just spend his money solving social problems? Because Gotham is just so corrupt that even charity just makes things worse. Congratulations. I'm not sure that was worth what it makes this movie argue about politics or about society, but you did solve the problem of Batman's money. The other big thing it brings to the story is the detective story or the noir element, though I hesitate to call it either of those things. And look, if we get stuck in a semantic argument about whether it qualifies, we'll never get out. So let's take it as read that the story wants to be taken on some level as a noirish detective story in which Batman tracks down a serial killer. I think it also then has to be taken as largely a failure on those terms in any respect other than the aesthetic, and not completely excluding the aesthetic. At best, its conception of noir is seen in terms of low-light, desaturated color and a kind of period piece aesthetic. Likewise, the detective story is present in the sense that Batman opens a file cabinet and draws some stuff, but his efforts to investigate things are pretty minimal and don't advance the story, and the movie falls back on the same implausible techno-gadgets that replaced investigation in The Dark Knight. The reality is that Batman does more investigating in Batman Begins than he does in The Batman, and for both the noir and detective story elements, these elements have been pulled back from where they are in The Long Halloween. Similarly, the replacement of the Holiday Killer with the Riddler is, in my opinion, pretty limiting. While the Holiday Killer is disturbed, their motivations are clear, their actions track, and they fit into the story in a way that makes them mysterious, makes tracking them down a mystery that the audience is a part of. The Riddler's anger at corruption is made clear, and elements of his backstory are made clear, but he doesn't connect to the world he's in or the characters in the sense that any relationship is built up or diminished, and his goals shift nebulously during the movie. His riddles are so comically bad that all you can really do is joke about them.
It's law right there. What is this, Riddler, stupid or something? Jesus, look at you two, world's greatest detectives.
And it does a very Far Cry 5 kind of decontextualizing of his perspective and his allies so that you're supposed to know what it's invoking, but it's immunized against anyone actually proving it. All of which brings it together as a pretty solid, kinda messy simplification of a well-liked comics arc, the kind of thing you would have seen, for better and for worse, in earlier days of the MCU. A solid, if overly pompous and elidable entry. Until the fourth act. Just over 2 hours into the movie, Batman and Gordon have tracked down and arrested the Riddler. For the remainder of the movie, Batman attempts to deal with the Riddler's last plan, a series of bombings that flood the city, and the simultaneous attack on the Arena, one of Gotham's emergency shelters, by the Riddler's assailants. This section, which occupies most of an hour, culminates with Batman shifting from a vigilante mode to a heroic one, rescuing the survivors from the Arena. Okay, let's start with this. What do I mean, a fourth act? What I mean is a substantial section of storytelling that seems to the viewer to come after the tension has been resolved. As a viewer, you bring with you your expectation of how stories look, so you come in ready for it to present the characters, the tension, the stakes, to complicate that, and then to resolve it. And then you try to sort of fit the movie into that framework, all the way up to misremembering the movie to make it slot into your expectations, like how you kind of gloss over the framing device in Saving Private Ryan because it works against the core tension and doesn't feel related to any of the events. Or a great example of a fourth act is in Casino Royale, a great movie in which a solid half hour of the movie happens after Le Chiffre dies. Remember that half hour? The one with the little finger scene?
That's because you know what I can do with my little finger.
I have no idea.
And the drowning? And the scene where Bond calls Mr. White? That kind of thing will happen because the filmmaker and the audience aren't quite lined up on what the tension is. In Casino Royale, the conflict reads as being Bond versus Le Chiffre, but the intended conflict is supposed to be, I think, Bond uncovering the organization that eventually turns out to be Spectre, which is the conflict through which Bond becomes the super spy we expect him to be, the transformation that Casino Royale frames with a great deal of ambivalence. And in a similar way, the Batman kind of feels, in your memory, like that adaptation of The Long Halloween, the Batman versus the Riddler, but that's not where the story ends. In fact, it's not close. The story ends almost an hour later. And I don't think that's an accident, or at least not the same kind of accident. The thing is, it really does just come out of nowhere. It features Batman dealing with a problem that hasn't been introduced before, the Riddler's huge terrorist attack and his allies. It primarily features few of what had been the major characters before, and stars characters that hadn't been significant before, those allies and the mayoral candidate Bella Real, with complications that come out of nowhere, like it turning out a bunch of Gotham is apparently below sea level. It's the only part of the story not clearly adapted from The Long Halloween, and especially if this entire section had been cut from the movie, nobody would be aware that some part of the story had been removed. But it's the most important part of the movie. It's the part of the movie where it finally starts to speak. Even if the things it has to say are not the world's most ambitious, and even if it's awkward and kind of crammed in there, it does finally get past being a simplification of a comics arc and a couple of half-assed discursive talking points and start to speak. What does it say? Well, I think we should step back and talk about Batman movies. Because there's a weirdness about the Batman franchise. Every Spider-Man movie that has ever been made, every one of them, is about young, overstretched Peter Parker struggling to balance his normal life, his relationship with his girlfriend MJ, or if you're feeling spicy, Gwen Stacy, and his school life or his first job, with his responsibility to use his superpowers to help people something that he's still kinda new at and that also places the people he loves in danger. Iron Man went through the same arc over and over again, not just in 3 Iron Man movies, but also at least 1 Avengers movie and at least 1 Captain America movie. Thor has been making basically the same kinds of mistakes and learning the same kinds of lessons in every one of his appearances. And that's fine. It might get a little boring when we get these movies as often as we do now, but at the root of those superheroes, there are elemental characters with simple, powerful frameworks, so those are the movies we get. But Batman has had movies in production continuously for more than 30 years, and it now has multiple timelines just so the studio can get Batman movies out even faster, and yet there is no through line of narrative, themes, or even characterization that lasted longer than 3 movies, usually less. Almost every Batman movie is a surprisingly artistic, director-driven reinterpretation, and the producer's efforts to get a hold of Batman and turn it into a safer bet have always failed. And yeah, Batman is rich. We've talked about that. He's an orphan, his parents were killed when he was young, he dresses up in a bat costume and fights crime, and Batman doesn't kill people, although the conceptual edges of all 4 words in that sentence have been stretched to the breaking point more than once. And he's got a butler. Past that, he's surprisingly flexible, so let's go through them. Say you go back to that 1966 Batman movie. The Batman you're going to see is a straightforward, heroic figure who is also straight man to a torrent of comic situations and figures. A character who's easy to root for in a situation that's easy to laugh at. That's something Batman's been in the comics, and specifically it was the Silver Age characterization that was being editorially pushed in the 60s and then faded in the early 70s. If you look at Tim Burton's Batman, you'll get, well, it's a Tim Burton movie, what do you think you're going to get? For Burton, Batman and the Joker are almost the same person, obsessively motivated by their trauma, ultimately transformed by it into a behavior they're not really in control of. This Batman isn't really heroic at all. He's not a villain, he's a static force that's created by psychological perturbation and trauma that happens to be conveniently on the side of justice. A thing that Bruce Wayne sometimes transforms into that, luckily for the rest of us, fights crime. And in fact, this characterization is static. His relationships change only as a result of other people's attitudes toward him changing. And that's definitely something Batman is a lot in comics, especially in his solo outings. Pick up the Schumacher movies, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, and you'll see, well, 2 Batmans. One of them is intensely toyetic, a character dressed like an action figure who moves like an action figure with toys like an action figure, plus a sidekick who's his own action figure, on sets that look straight out of the big expensive action figure boxes, the ones on the bottom shelf at a toy store that your mom never let you get. The other is, well, okay, what people say about Schumacher's Batman is that it's gay, but I think that gets twisted around a bit, that people think gay like homoerotic, and I'd caution against that because straight male gaze is actually all over these movies, but here are 2 things about how Schumacher presents Batman. First, the playing up of Batman and Robin's costumes, the campy, unattenuated display, and the way it's presented as strictly an idealized male form. Not taken for granted, but presented forthrightly and without any of the justifications about practicality. It's all a bit, well, here's a comparison. So yeah. Second, Batman Forever is basically a movie about a man with 2 lives. In one life, he is tightly controlled, uncomfortable, inhabiting a persona, going through the motions, but at night, he gets to put on a disguise and go out and be himself. Be someone he likes, be surrounded by men in a context he's comfortable with, a context he knows how to relate to. The central emotional conflict of the movie is the possibility that this real persona, a persona where he behaves and acts and associates with people he's comfortable with, will be outed, a conflict that's resolved when he embraces both sides of his life.
I had to save them both. You see, I'm both Bruce Wayne and Batman. Not because I have to be. Now, because I choose to be.
Is that gay? Well, it's sure not straight. And is that a Batman? Absolutely. In the words of pop film academic Will Brooker, gay readings of the Batman and Robin relationship progressed through a 40-year process from the taboo, the confessions of young boys in a readjustment center, to the tongue-in-cheek and ironic in-crowd enjoyment of the TV show's camp, and finally achieved an out public status. Queer readings of the dynamic duo are an open secret. As you probably know, Batman and Robin was such a flop that Warner shelved a fifth movie to figure out what to make next, and it's common at this point in retrospectives to sort of skate through the next 8 years and talk about Batman disappearing from our screens and then re-emerging. But I do think it's important to note that Warner's was never planning on taking a break from Batman. In fact, the idea as of Batman and Robin was to start accelerating on Batman. They just got stuck between ideas. Adaptations of Batman Beyond and The Dark Knight Returns, a Batman v Superman script that bears a remarkable structural similarity to the Batman v Superman movie we got 20 years later, and the thing that really held the interest of executives at Warner's, an adaptation of Batman Year One, a retelling of Batman's origin story that made Batman a vulnerable, novice figure up against a gritty, corrupt, overpowering city, the idea that eventually found form in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Batman Begins is interesting. On one level, Begins is a Batman origin story. As reinterpreted by Christopher Nolan, who's not really a Batman fan, only a few pieces of the Year One story are directly preserved, and personally, I'm pretty glad the child prostitute, the dominatrix Catwoman, that Gordon's affair, and a ton of other Frank Miller stuff is just thrown out the window. On the other hand, the sterility of Nolan's style, the stiffness of Batman's costume, and the presumably directed blankness of Bale's performance, along with the performances of Liam Neeson and Katie Holmes, mean that the scripted story and the dialogue have a weight that, outside of some, though not all, great action sequences, is not really conveyed visually. On another level, the movie inaugurates Nolan's career as a blockbuster filmmaker, so it's interesting to see the audiovisual and storytelling styles of Inception and Interstellar and Tenet in a less complete form. But on a third, and I think most interesting level, Begins is deeply interested in the construction of symbols, especially the construction of fear. Begins has three antagonists: the corruption in the city of Gotham, who's embodied as Carmine Falcone, Ra's al Ghul, and Scarecrow, and all three antagonists are characterized primarily by their relationship to fear, specifically how they weaponize and systematize fear to achieve their ends. In all three cases, the film takes pains to have the character say this explicitly to the audience. Begins' Batman responds to this not by repudiating fear, but by turning fear around. The villains use fear to intimidate decent people. Batman uses fear to intimidate them in return.
Why bats, Master Wayne?
Bats frighten me. This time my enemies shared my dread.
And so the movie culminates with a literal battle over the literal manifestation of fear to decide who gets to control the fear in Gotham City. And yes, it should go without saying, this Batman, the Batman whose primary weapon against the criminals is fear, that's definitely a Batman. That said, by The Dark Knight, a lot of the interest in the symbolic has faded, and that leaves Nolan's Batman in a less interesting place. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of ways The Dark Knight is really, really good, but on the level of meaning, a lot has been lost. Without the investigation of the symbolic construction of fear, of intimidation, what's left is the simplistic, ill-considered, and reactionary politics that were underneath that. The Dark Knight's Batman, and the Batman of The Dark Knight Rises, which has the same viewpoint more explicitly, is the representative of the established order. His enemies are the agents of disorder, and that's the whole framing. All concept of Batman as an agent of positive social change is lost. All concept that there's such a thing as positive social change is lost. The system is good, people who have a problem with the system are bad. In fact, The Dark Knight takes pains to represent Batman not as a vigilante, which would be bad.
What gives you the right? What's the difference between you and me?
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
But as fundamentally one of Gotham's governing institutions, which is what makes him good. Ultimately, it's the same kind of framing as 24, that sure, it's important for the people in charge to respect civil rights and due process and all that boring stuff, as long as there's some virtuous government agents who work outside the rules to get things done.
Who appointed the Batman?
We did.
All of us who stood by and let scum take control of our city.
But this is a democracy, Harvey.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city.
But even 24 had a more compelling character story and the grace to show more moral ambivalence than The Dark Knight summons. And by The Dark Knight Rises, this all goes from framing to text. A more blatant representation with its army of hero cops marching to save the city from the people who think wealth and equality is bad.
There's only one police in this town.
And that's more straightforwardly frustrating, too blatant to enjoy in spite of yourself, too preachy to love even if you don't mind that portrayal. And this is also Batman. This is every Batman vs. Joker story ever. Joker is the avatar of chaos, so when you present the Joker as Batman's foil, this part, the avatar of order, is the part of Batman that you are always pulling on. As for Zack Snyder's Batman, well, I'm sure you've already heard tons about it, read about it. I'm sure you have your own opinion, so I'll just say, for better or for worse, and personally I do think it's for worse, Snyder's Batman is a mythic figure, a sort of demigod. Like Achilles, he's not quite a figure beyond morality, but a figure possessed of both a flattened, inaccessible, and melodramatic psychology, and a sheer power that makes his behavior a force of nature, which, together, morality feel irrelevant both in the story and the reading. To the extent he has a character arc, has growth, it's essentially a series of emotional states that he progresses through. Is that a Batman? Well, yeah, it's the Batman of some of the most famous and enduring Batman stories, and the ones that Snyder admits he personally responds to most, and the ones that persuaded the audience that Batman was a grim character with grim stories. All of these, the straightforward hero in silly situations, the monster, the action figure, the queer icon, the symbol of vengeful fear, the avatar of the established order, and the superhuman demigod. These are all things Batman can be, things Batman has been, which is to say, on the one hand, Batman is hard to adapt to an audience's satisfaction because, while there are tons of Batman fans, they're all responding to different characterizations, and they all think the other characterizations are not my Batman. On the other hand, Batman is a huge creative opportunity. You have a hugely recognizable character and an opportunity to interpret that character any number of ways, and you'll always be able to find something in the comics to draw from. So with all that said, who is the Batman's Batman? Well, to some extent it's the Long Halloween's Batman. The Batman is younger and rougher and angrier, but that's not a vision, that's just a point in time. Well, there's a lot of resemblance between Reeves' Batman and Nolan's, which is probably very appropriate for two adaptations of such closely related stories. They're both very human, but Nolan's portrayal and Bale's performance, besides the couple of times we see Batman from a criminal's perspective, really does not give you access to Bruce Wayne's inner life beyond the literal content of the screenplay. When he retires at the end of The Dark Knight Rises, even though the scripts of the three movies have been explicit, there's really very little sense from the visual storytelling that he reached the conclusion of a life spent fighting crime. By contrast, Reeves' portrayal and Pattinson's performance are so melodramatic, they start to read as parody. His inner darkness is emo, angsty, and kinda childish. He shouts about vengeance and he draws overdramatic nonsense and he stands out in the rain just so people will see how sad he is. It's honestly hard to tell whether this is a lack of subtlety or whether you're really earnestly supposed to find Bruce unsympathetic. Either way, the movie spends the entire runtime of a movie constructing a Batman who is utterly familiar, but then it does stretch out that runtime so it can change him. Or more accurately, so it can recontextualize him, and that is the thing. The transformation, for all that it is strictly contextual. When Batman goes from punching guys out to leading people out of danger, we are meant to see a transformation of the character, from the one who insists that he is vengeance, to the one that makes himself a positive symbol. And though I wouldn't go quite this far, I think you could make the argument that Reeves deliberately spends 2 hours reconstructing Batman Begins specifically, from the focus on organized crime to the magically disappearing police corruption, so that he can directly rebut Nolan's argument to say that Batman as a rejoinder to corruption doesn't work as a mirrored symbol of fear, but does work as a new symbol of hope. And yes, in this fourth act, Batman does change from a symbol of fear to a symbol of hope, but there's actually very little growth here. The Batman we see at the start of the movie might have been an asshole, but it's hard to believe he wouldn't behave the ways we see at the end of the movie. The imagery is really powerful, and I think that covers over a lot of weakness in the storytelling. Batman doesn't decide to change his behavior, he just ends up in a situation where some people need saving, and he's run out of people to punch. The act of saving those people seems to change him, and that's what we're told in the end, but since it's the very last thing that actually happens in the movie, all we've got is Pattinson's voiceover to that effect. Even if the character change isn't quite as meaningful as the storytelling wants us to think, doing that storytelling is at least a recognizable shift on its own, an argument for a kind of storytelling that hasn't been in many recent Batman movies. So, does this all work? I think ordinarily I'd say no, not really. Like I said before, when you veer off the act structure this way, your audience is going to try to cram your work back into it, down to misremembering the content of the movie. Most of the movie is a self-contained story in which Batman fights the Riddler, and that contains a coherent and familiar depiction of Batman and coherent and familiar themes. Then there's an easily discarded piece hanging off the end of the story that transforms it. And the reality is that awkward transformation, that message, probably does not land for most viewers, probably does not really land even for most invested viewers. I mean, when you say your thesis statement at the end of the movie, people hear it.
I have to become more. People need hope. To know someone's out there for them.
But not in a way that functions as commentary on the whole enterprise, not in a way that reads as a new demand for a different kind of Batman story. But in a way, they've succeeded by failing at that. The movie is so successful on the audience's own terms that Reeves is being brought back to make the sequel and to spearhead televised spin-offs. So he has an opportunity that authors trying to turn the battleship rarely get, an opportunity to use the follow-up to cement the transformation, an opportunity to make not just the events, but the interpretation canon. So where do you go from here? The movie nods to No Man's Land, which is pretty much next on the list of most popular Batman comic arcs anyway. We could go through all of that arc's characters, all of its moving pieces, but they're not going to make a chapter-for-chapter remake of the comics arc, so let's skip that. Instead, they could do with getting a little weirder. Not that there's a specific arc I am into, I just think, not every one of these stories needs to be serious every minute of the movie. So if you're going to do something like No Man's Land, do a cold open of Batman dragging Killer Croc out of the water and punching him out on a makeshift barge. And it would be nice to see members of the Bat family. It could be Tim Drake, it could be Barbara Gordon. Heck, Cassandra Cain's in No Man's Land. She'd work great as a first sidekick. I'm not attached to these specific characters. This is part of Batman that we haven't seen put on screen in a while. Because here's the thing. Movie Batman almost universally has a really adolescent attitude toward his family. He loved his parents died, now he's angry. Even though the Batman is really interested in Batman's dead father, Thomas Wayne, it actually does less, considerably less, than The Long Halloween to humanize Thomas or add texture to Batman's relationship to his parents, even though it's a major driving factor of the story. I get it, it is a powerful hook, but it's been 3 decades. I do say almost universally, because one Batman movie was kind of interested in that.
I'm older now than my father ever was.
Though Snyder does a poor job exploring it, he does seem deeply interested in Batman trying to transition into adulthood. I simplified Snyder's conception of Batman before, and I want to come back to it now. And I want to be clear that I think that in the movies this is poorly told, but there is an arc that Snyder's Batman almost has. This scene is the key to that arc. Snyder's Batman is older and alone and struggling with having devoted his life to a thing that he's not sure about anymore. He's in his 40s, and he's single, and alone. What'll be his legacy? And he's thinking of his father.
I'm older now than my father ever was.
A man he doesn't know. Is this the legacy he made for his father? So he builds the Justice League. Of course, this happens almost entirely off-screen and is never really developed. Here's the thing. This is older and grimmer Batman, but older and grimmer Batman means like in his 40s. Thomas Wayne was probably like 35 when he died. He was Robert Pattinson's age. Batman sees his father as ageless because he died before Batman was old enough to see him as an adult. And I'd like to see us go a little harder on that, a little harder on getting from the Batman monomaniacally motivated by a single trauma in his past to a more complete character. So here we are. Batman has learned that he should be less of an emo rage monster and more of a role model. We've accepted the possibility that Batman can grow. It would be a great time to see that growth toward an older, happier, more comfortable Batman. The Batman with friends, with exes, with kids. More than that, I just want to see Batman be weird. The Batman is the closest that this surprisingly weird, surprisingly inventive franchise has come to getting MCUified, and I'm so glad it does more or less dodge it. And if I have one request for Batman on film in the future, it's keep having ideas. Do No Man's Land if you can see something compelling to engage with there, not because The Long Halloween worked and No Man's Land is next on the list. Bring in the Bat family because they add a new dimension you want to explore, not because people on social media are clamoring for their favorite Batman side characters. Whatever it is, please just do it because you found a story there. A story you really want to tell.